The following story contains elements of suspense, supernatural folklore, and psychological horror. It is intended for a mature audience that enjoys a good scare. Listener discretion is advised. The wind doesn't just blow through the valley of Silver Creek. It sighs. It's a weary sound, the kind made by a place that has seen its best days crumble like the rusted machinery in the abandoned iron mines. For decades, Silver Creek, Pennsylvania, was a place of grit and coal dust. But when the mines closed, the heartbeat of the town slowed to a rhythmic, agonizing thud. The young people left for the cities. The paint on the Victorian storefronts peeled like sunburned skin, and the silence became heavy. It was Mayor Miller who had the brilliant idea. Sitting in a wood-paneled office that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, he looked at the town council. "People don't come here for the history anymore," he barked, slamming a hand on a map of the surrounding dense Appalachian woods. "They want thrills. They want spooky America. If we don't have a ghost, we're going to invent one." And so, over a weekend of coffee and whispered brainstorming, the grinning harvester was born. The legend was simple, crafted to be perfectly viral. They claimed that back in the 1700s, a twisted farmer had made a deal with the soil to never go hungry, eventually turning into a creature made of husks and shadow that reappeared every 50 years. They printed flyers with artificial aging. They leaked grainy photos to paranormal forums, and they built a massive, terrifying scarecrow at the edge of the woods. It was a masterpiece of marketing, a harmless lie to bring in the tourist dollars and save their homes. Elias, the town's youngest archivist, watched the preparations with a knot in his stomach. He was a man of facts and dusty ledgers, and there was something inherently wrong about polluting the town's genuine history with a fabrication. As he walked home through the cooling October air, the smell of damp earth was unusually pungent. The woods seemed to lean in, as if listening to the townspeople rehearse their scripted, scary stories for the upcoming festival. The first night of the Harvester Festival was a resounding success. Neon lights from food trucks clashed with the orange glow of jack-o'-lanterns. Tourists from Philadelphia and New York wandered the streets, shivering with delighted fear as local actors in burlap masks jumped out from the shadows. The cash registers were ringing for the first time in years. Mayor Miller stood on the town hall steps, beaming with pride. The lie was working. The town was being reborn through a ghost that didn't exist. But as the clock struck midnight, marking the end of the first day, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature plummeted, not with the crispness of autumn, but with a bone-deep, unnatural chill. Elias, finishing his shift at the archives, noticed a group of tourists gathered near the edge of the great cornfield that bordered the town. They were pointing at something. Standing near the treeline was a figure. It wasn't the actor. Elias knew the actor was currently at the local diner getting a burger. This figure was taller, unnervingly thin, and stood perfectly still. It didn't jump or roar. It simply existed. It was wearing a tattered duster coat that looked like it had been buried for a century, and even from a distance Elias could see a faint, yellowed glimmer where a mouth should be. A grin that was too wide, too fixed, and far too real. When Elias blinked, the figure was gone. Only the cornstalks remained, swaying in a wind that no one else seemed to feel. A cold realization washed over him. They had spent weeks calling out to a monster, giving it a name, a history, and a face. And in the dark, quiet corners of the world where folklore breathes, something had finally answered. Honesty is the bedrock of a community. When we build our prosperity on a foundation of deception, we invite forces into our lives that we cannot control. The morning sun over Silver Creek usually brought a sense of renewal, but the day after the festival's opening, the light felt thin and brittle. A low-hanging mist clung to the valley floor, refusing to burn away even as the clock moved toward noon. While the townspeople swept up candy wrappers and prepared for another day of profitable haunts, a heavy, silent dread began to settle in the places where the shadows lingered longest. Leo, a 19-year-old with a shock of dark hair and a cynical streak, was one of the many locals hired to run the haunted hayride. He didn't believe in the grinning harvester. He had helped his uncle build the wooden scaffolds for the scarecrows, and he'd been the one to spray paint the ancient symbols on the barn doors. To him, the legend was just a paycheck, a way to put gas in his truck so he could eventually drive out of this dead-end town for good. As Leo drove the tractor through the narrow paths of the great cornfield to check the trail for debris, the air felt different. The corn, which had been golden and dry the day before, seemed to have turned a sickly, bruised purple overnight. The stalks were taller than they should have been, their long leaves reaching out like serrated fingers to scrape against the sides of the tractor. He pulled to a stop at Station 4, a clearing where they had placed a prop of a ruined colonial cabin. In the center of the clearing, something was wrong. According to the script the town council had written, the harvester required a silver tribute to stay his hand. The props team had scattered some plastic, silver-painted coins around the cabin to add to the atmosphere. But when Leo stepped off the tractor, he didn't see plastic. He saw a circle of black, scorched earth. In the middle of that circle sat a pile of real, tarnished silver, antique spoons, thimbles, and a heavy, ornate locket, all of it covered in a thick, translucent slime. The smell was the worst part. It wasn't the scent of the farm. It was the metallic, cloying odor of a butcher shop mixed with stagnant pond water. Leo knelt, reaching out a hand to pick up the locket, but a sudden, violent rustle in the corn made him freeze. It wasn't the sound of a small animal or a gust of wind. It was the sound of something heavy moving with unnatural speed, the stalks snapping like dry bone as it circled the clearing. "Is someone there?" Leo called out, his voice cracking. "The field is closed to the public. This isn't part of the show." There was no answer, only a rhythmic, wet clicking sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. The mist in the clearing thickened, turning from white to a suffocating gray. Leo scrambled back toward the tractor, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he climbed into the seat, he glanced back at the circle of scorched earth. The silver tribute was gone. In its place was a single, fresh corn husk, folded into the unmistakable shape of a human hand, pointing directly at him. He didn't wait to see more. He slammed the tractor into gear and roared back toward the main road, the engine screaming in protest. When he reached the festival gates, he found Mayor Miller and Elias talking near the ticket booth. Leo jumped down, his face pale and sweat-streaked, babbling about the silver and the hand made of husks. The mayor laughed it off, clapping Leo on the back and telling him he had too much imagination. But Elias didn't laugh. Elias looked at Leo's boots. There, stuck to the leather, was a single wet corn leaf that looked less like a plant and more like a piece of emerald-colored skin. The sun began to set earlier than the charts predicted, casting long, distorted shadows across the town square. The festival-goers were returning, their laughter echoing through the streets, unaware that the attraction they were visiting was no longer a stage-managed performance. The grinning harvester had received its first tribute, and the entity born of the town's lies was beginning to grow hungry for something more than silver. Curiosity is a gift, but it must be paired with the wisdom to recognize when a game has become a reality. We must respect the boundaries between the stories we tell and the truths we wake. The second night of the festival descended upon Silver Creek with a thickness that felt physical. The mist from the morning had not dissipated. Instead, it had curdled into a heavy, gray shroud that smelled faintly of wet earth and ancient, rotting wood. Despite the gloom, the town square was alive. Strings of amber Edison bulbs crisscrossed the streets, casting a warm but flickering light on the faces of hundreds of tourists. To the visitors, the fog was a stroke of atmospheric genius. To Elias, it felt like the breath of something massive and patient, exhaling over the town. Elias sat in the makeshift festival headquarters, a converted storefront, flipping through the personnel manifest. His hands were trembling slightly. According to the records, they had hired exactly 3 actors to play the grinning harvester. One was stationed at the entrance of the corn maze, one was at the gallows photo op, and the third, a tall girl named Sarah, was patrolling the main street. But the reports coming in over the walkie-talkies were making no sense. "Hey, Elias!" A voice crackled over the radio. It was Miller's assistant, a nervous man named Greg. "Tell the guy in the alley behind the bakery to tone it down. He's standing perfectly still, just staring at people, and it's actually making the kids cry. It's a bit much for a family event, don't you think?" Elias keyed the mic, his heart sinking. Sarah is on the main street. The other 2 are at the cornfield. There shouldn't be anyone in the bakery alley. Check if it's a local kid pulling a prank. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the damp night. The air was so cold it stung his lungs. As he moved toward the bakery, he passed groups of teenagers laughing and pointing. "Did you see that actor?" One girl whispered to her friend. "The one by the old well? I've never seen a costume that looked so wet. It looked like he was made of vines." Elias pushed through the crowd, his boots clicking on the cobblestones. He reached the mouth of the alley behind the bakery. The light from the street lamp was flickering, struggling against the encroaching fog. There, at the far end of the narrow passage, stood a figure. It was draped in a long, tattered duster that seemed to be dripping, though it hadn't rained. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its head tilted at an impossible sharp angle. "Is that you, Sarah?" Elias called out, his voice sounding small in the narrow space. The figure didn't move. It didn't breathe. In the dim light, Elias could see the texture of the mask. It didn't look like burlap or latex. It looked like layers of dried, yellowed corn husks stitched together with something dark and sinewy. And the grin, the mouth was a jagged tear in the fabric of the face, stretched wide to reveal rows of what looked like sharpened, blackened teeth. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward. It didn't walk. It jerked. Its limbs moved with the stuttering, mechanical rhythm of a stop-motion film. With every movement, the sound of dry leaves rustling and wood snapping echoed off the brick walls. Elias froze, a primal terror locking his muscles. This wasn't a costume. There were no zippers, no seams, no human eyes behind the husks. There was only a void. "Elias!" A hand slammed onto his shoulder, making him jump nearly out of his skin. It was Mayor Miller, looking flushed and celebratory. "Can you believe the buzz? People are saying this is the most immersive haunt in the state. That actor in the alley, whoever you hired for that spot, deserves a bonus. The stillness, the commitment, it's terrifying." Elias turned back to the alley, his finger trembling as he pointed. "Mayor, look, that's not." But the alley was empty. The figure had vanished into the mist in the blink of an eye. There were no footprints on the damp ground, only a few stray husks and a small, blackened puddle that smelled of the same metallic rot Leo had described earlier. Mayor Miller laughed, oblivious to the dread radiating off Elias. "See? Professional. They know exactly when to disappear to keep the mystery alive. Come on, the evening parade is starting. We need to be front and center." As the mayor walked away, Elias knelt and picked up one of the husks. It was ice cold to the touch, and as he held it, he felt a sharp, stinging sensation in his palm. He looked down and saw a thin, red line where the edge of the husk had sliced his skin. The plant hadn't just cut him. It felt as though it had tried to drink. He watched as the drop of blood was absorbed instantly into the yellowed leaf, turning it a deep, healthy green. The parade began with drums and cheers, but Elias stood in the shadows, watching the edges of the crowd. He realized then that the town hadn't just created a legend. They had built a vessel. And now, something ancient and hungry was wearing that vessel like a suit of armor, hiding in plain sight among the revelers. When we pretend to be something we are not, we create a mask that the world may eventually force us to wear. Authenticity is our greatest protection against the shadows of our own making. The cut on Elias's palm did not heal. By the following morning, the thin red line had darkened to a deep, bruised purple, and the skin around it felt as hot as a fever dream. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see the festival or the smiling faces of the tourists. He saw the wide, jagged grin of the harvester, etched into the very fabric of his eyelids. The town was celebrating its resurrection, but Elias felt as though Silver Creek was being measured for a coffin. While the rest of the town council gathered at the diner to gloat over the morning's glowing newspaper reviews, Elias retreated to the basement of the Silver Creek Historical Society. The air down there was stagnant, smelling of silverfish and disintegrating leather. He wasn't looking for the history they had invented. He was looking for the history they had ignored. He spent hours pulling at the threads of the town's founding, digging through journals of the first settlers and maps drawn before the iron mines had even been a glimmer in a prospector's eye. Near the bottom of a cedar chest labeled Founding Records, 1780 to 1810, Elias found a leather-bound diary with no name on the cover. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. As he turned the pages, his breath caught. There were no accounts of the grinning harvester by name, but there were sketches, crude, frantic drawings of a figure made of vines and stalks, standing amidst the first cabins. Beside the drawings were notes in a frantic script. The soil remembers the broken oath. The forest does not hear our prayers, only our lies. The diary belonged to a man named Silas Thorne, a surveyor who had helped cheat the local indigenous tribes out of the valley land. Thorne wrote of a warning given to him by a displaced elder, a warning about a shadow known as the Unexplained, or the echo of the deceiver. The entity wasn't a ghost of a dead man. It was a manifestation of the earth's judgment. According to the legend, if a community built its foundation on a great deception, the soil would sprout a reaper to harvest the liars and return the truth to the ground. A cold sweat broke out on Elias's forehead. The town council had thought they were being clever, pulling a story out of thin air. But they hadn't invented the harvester. They had accidentally described the Unexplained so accurately that they had effectively invited it back. By giving it a face, a name, and a tradition, they had provided the entity with the precise form it needed to cross over from the shadows into the physical world. The fake legend wasn't a lie. It was an accidental ritual. He scrambled out of the basement, the diary clutched to his chest, and ran toward the town hall. He found Mayor Miller standing on the balcony, overlooking the bustling town square where a giant effigy of the harvester was being raised for the evening's centerpiece. "Mayor, you have to stop this," Elias shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We didn't make this up. We woke it up. Look at this diary. Look at the warnings." Miller didn't even turn around. He was staring at the crowd below, his eyes glazed with a strange, glassy fervor. "Don't be a spoilsport, Elias. Look at those people. Look at the money. The harvester is the best thing that ever happened to this town. If the legend is real, then it just proves we're doing something right. It means we're famous." He laughed, but the sound was hollow, ending in a dry, rasping cough that sounded like rustling corn husks. As Elias watched in horror, A single dried leaf fell from the cuff of the mayor's expensive suit jacket. Then another. Miller didn't seem to notice. He reached out to grip the balcony railing, and Elias saw that the mayor's fingernails were turning a dull, woody brown, curling like the edges of a dying plant. The deception wasn't just in the town's stories anymore. It was beginning to take root in the very people who had told the first lie. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting a blood-red light over Silver Creek. In the distance, at the edge of the great cornfield, the massive scarecrow effigy seemed to shift its weight, its burlap head tilting toward the town hall. The festival lights flickered, and for a brief second, every speaker in the town emitted a high-pitched, screeching feedback that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in a language no one had spoken for centuries. The harvest was coming, and the fake legend was ready to claim its creators. The past is never truly buried. It is only waiting for us to forget so that it can remind us of its power. We must respect the history of the land we inhabit, for the earth has a long memory and a low tolerance for those who treat it with deceit. The night air was thick with the scent of buttered popcorn and wood smoke, a classic American autumn scene that masked a rot growing beneath the surface. Thousands had gathered in the town square for the Harvester's Eve celebration. A temporary stage had been erected in front of the town hall, bathed in harsh, blue-white spotlights that made the surrounding shadows look like deep, ink-filled trenches. A local news crew from the city had arrived to live-stream the event, their cameras perched like vultures waiting for a story. Mayor Miller stood behind the curtain of the stage, tugging at his collar. His skin felt like parchment, dry, stiff, and agonizingly tight. Every breath he took rattled in his chest like wind through a dead thicket. He looked at his reflection in a small vanity mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites replaced by a jaundiced, corn-silk yellow. Yet, the greed in his heart was stronger than the sickness in his bones. He straightened his tie, forced a pained smile, and stepped out into the blinding light. The crowd erupted in cheers. "People of Silver Creek," Miller shouted into the microphone, his voice booming through the massive speakers. "Tonight, we celebrate our heritage. We celebrate the legend that put us back on the map. Tonight, the grinning harvester walks among us, not as a curse, but as a symbol of our town's unbeatable spirit." In the back of the crowd, Elias stood near the sound booth, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw what the others didn't. He saw the way the shadows behind the mayor were lengthening, detaching themselves from the wooden beams of the stage. He saw the massive, straw-filled effigy at the edge of the square tilt its head, though there was no wind. Elias tried to push through the throng of people, but the crowd was a solid wall of cameras and laughing tourists. On stage, Miller's speech began to falter. We built this," he stammered, his hand gripping the podium so hard the wood began to splinter. A strand of green, vine-like vein pulsed on his forehead. "We gave him life, and he gives us." Suddenly, Miller stopped. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. Instead, a single dried corn silk thread drifted out from between his lips. The audience went silent, thinking it was part of the act. The news camera zoomed in on the mayor's face. Behind him, the shadows coalesced into a towering figure. It was the harvester, draped in its rotting duster, its face a jagged, stitched nightmare of husks. It didn't sneak. It simply manifested, its presence snuffing out the heat of the spotlights. The creature reached out a long, spindly hand, fingers made of sharpened willow branches, and placed it gently on Miller's shoulder. A collective gasp rippled through the square. The mayor didn't scream. He looked into the camera, his yellowed eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. "It's all true," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that carried over the speakers. The lie, it's hungry. In a flash of movement too fast for the human eye to follow, the spotlights flickered and died. For 3 seconds, the square was plunged into total, suffocating darkness. A sound like 1,000 dry stalks being crushed filled the air, followed by a sudden violent gust of wind that smelled of ancient earth. When the backup generators kicked in and the lights hummed back to life, the stage was empty. The podium was knocked over. The microphone lay on the floor, emitting a low, rhythmic hum. Mayor Miller was gone. The creature was gone. The only thing left behind was a long, winding trail of dried corn husks and dark, sticky sap that led from the center of the stage, down the steps, and straight toward the dark wall of the great cornfield. Panic didn't set in immediately. It was too quiet for panic. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the news reporter dropping her microphone. Elias ran to the stage, sliding through the trail of husks. He picked one up. It was still warm, vibrating with a low, malevolent energy. He looked out at the thousands of terrified faces in the square and realized that the show was over. The legend had taken its architect, and now it was looking at the rest of the town as its next crop. Leadership is a sacred trust. When those in power lead their people into a web of deceit for personal gain, they are often the first to be consumed by the very darkness they invited in. The disappearance of Mayor Miller turned the festive air of Silver Creek into a cold, suffocating panic. While the tourists scrambled for their cars, clogging the narrow mountain roads in a frantic bid to escape, Elias did the opposite. He didn't head for the highway. He headed deeper into the woods, toward the dead shoulders of the mountain where the cell service died and the trees grew so close together they seemed to form a solid wooden wall. He was looking for Old Man Whitaker, a man the town treated as a ghost long before he was actually dead. Whitaker lived in a cabin made of hand-hewn hemlock, a structure that looked less like a house and more like it had sprouted from the forest floor. He was the last descendant of the town's founding families who hadn't sold out to the mining companies or the tourist board. As Elias pulled his truck onto the moss-covered driveway, he saw the old man sitting on the porch, a double-barreled shotgun across his lap and a circle of salt poured meticulously around his rocking chair. "You're late, boy," Whitaker rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. He didn't look at Elias. His eyes were fixed on the treeline, where the mist was beginning to coil like a waking serpent. "I told your father and his father before him, you don't play with the names of the old things. You don't build a playground on top of a grave." Elias stumbled onto the porch, the diary from the archives clutched in his trembling hands. "We didn't know, Whitaker. We thought we were just making up a story to save the town. We didn't think there was anything actually there." He opened the diary to the sketches of the Niscala. "Is this what's happening? Is the harvester real?" Whitaker finally looked at him, and Elias was struck by the deep, hollow sadness in the old man's eyes. "The harvester is whatever we feed it. The land here was taken through blood and lies. Silas Thorne promised the tribes a share of the harvest, then burned their fields to drive them out. The Niscala is the memory of that lie. It's a vacuum, Elias, a great, empty hunger that waits for a shape. For 200 years it was a whisper. But you fools, you gave it a name. You gave it a face. You gave it a costume and a festival. You built it a body out of your own greed, and now it has stepped into it." The wind began to howl, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a rhythmic, wet clicking, the same sound Leo had heard in the cornfield. From the darkness of the pines, a tall, spindly shape emerged. It wasn't the harvester yet, but a shadow of it, a flickering silhouette that seemed to absorb the light of Elias's flashlight. Whitaker raised his shotgun, but his hands were shaking. "It's not just the mayor it wants," the old man whispered. It's the whole lie. It will reap everything that isn't true until there's nothing left of Silver Creek but the dirt. There has to be a way to stop it, Elias pleaded, his voice cracking. We can't just let it take everyone. Whitaker spat on the floor. The only way to kill a lie is with a truth so sharp it draws blood. The entity is wearing the legend like a suit of armor. You have to strip the legend away. You have to go back to the great cornfield, to the center where you raised that giant effigy, and you have to offer it the one thing no one in this town has been willing to give for 2 centuries. The honest, ugly truth of what this place is. Before Elias could ask what that meant, a massive weight slammed into the side of the cabin, making the timber groan and the salt circle break. A long wooden claw, looking like a sharpened rake, shattered the window behind Whitaker. The old man didn't scream. He just looked at Elias and pointed toward the truck. Go! It's not interested in an old man who's already dead. It wants the ones who still have a future to lose. Get to the field before the moon hits its peak. Elias scrambled back to his truck, the sound of Whitaker's shotgun firing echoing through the woods behind him. As he sped down the mountain, he looked in the rearview mirror. In the middle of the road stood the harvester, its wide, jagged grin illuminated for a split second by his taillights. It wasn't chasing him. It was waiting for him. It knew exactly where he was going. It was letting him go to the field because the field was its home, and the harvest was only just beginning. We cannot outrun the consequences of our ancestors' actions if we continue to repeat their mistakes. To heal the present, we must first be brave enough to acknowledge the sins of the past. The road should have led to the highway, but the asphalt seemed to be stretching, pulling Elias back toward the heart of the rot. He slammed his foot on the gas, the engine of his truck roaring in the unnatural silence of the valley. According to the odometer, he had driven 6 miles, more than enough to reach the interstate, but the scenery hadn't changed. The same twisted oak tree, the same rusted billboard for Miller's Hardware, and the same low stone wall kept appearing in the sweep of his headlights. The geography of Silver Creek was folding in on itself, turning the town into a closed loop. Elias gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He checked his phone, but the screen was a mess of jagged, static lines. The GPS didn't show a map. It showed a flickering image of a compass needle spinning wildly, as if the very concept of north had been erased. He wasn't just lost in the woods. He was trapped in the narrative the town had created. The fake legend had become a physical boundary, a wall of mist and shadow that refused to let any of the liars escape the harvest. Suddenly, a figure bolted into the middle of the road. Elias slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing before coming to a screeching halt inches from the person. It was Leo. The young man was shivering, his haunted hayride uniform torn to shreds, his eyes wide with a terror that looked like madness. He wasn't carrying a flashlight or a phone. He was clutching a bundle of dried cornstalks as if it were a shield. It's not letting us out, Elias, Leo screamed, pounding on the hood of the truck. I tried the back roads. I tried the hiking trails. Every time I walk into the fog, I end up back at the festival gates. The trees, they're moving. They're closing the gaps. We're in a cage. Leo climbed into the passenger seat, his teeth chattering. He smelled like the iron mines, damp, metallic, and old. He told Elias that the other locals who had tried to flee had simply disappeared into the mist, their screams cut short by the sound of snapping wood. Elias looked through the windshield. The fog wasn't just vapor anymore. It was thick with floating debris, bits of corn silk, dried leaves, and what looked like charred scraps of the harvester flyers they had distributed weeks ago. The town square, which should have been miles behind them, began to glow through the haze. Without Elias turning the wheel, the truck drifted forward, the tires crunching over a road that was no longer asphalt, but a carpet of dead vegetation. They rolled into the center of Silver Creek, and the sight made Elias's blood run cold. The thousands of tourists were gone, their cars abandoned in the middle of the streets with the doors wide to the night. The town was empty, yet it felt more crowded than ever. Every storefront window was filled with scarecrows. Not the plastic ones from the store, but crude, handmade effigies that hadn't been there an hour ago. They stood behind the glass, their burlap heads turned toward the street, watching the truck crawl by. "They're the ones who didn't get out," Leo whispered, pointing at a scarecrow wearing a familiar gold-rimmed pair of glasses. The same ones the town's librarian always wore. "The harvester is changing us. He's turning the town into his own garden." The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. The entity wasn't just killing people. It was harvesting their identities, stripping away their humanity to fuel its own growth. The truck's engine sputtered and died right in front of the great cornfield's entrance. The massive wooden archway, decorated with "Welcome to the Harvest" banners, looked like a gaping mouth. In the center of the field, the giant effigy they had built stood silhouetted against a moon the color of a bruised plum. Elias knew Whitaker was right. They couldn't run. The only way out was through the center of the lie, into the heart of the field where the harvester waited to see if anyone in Silver Creek had a single shred of truth left to offer. A lie is a wall we build around ourselves to hide from the world. Eventually, we find that the wall has become a prison. Freedom can only be found by tearing down the deceptions we have spent our lives constructing. The entrance to the great cornfield was no longer the cheerful tourist attraction it had been 48 hours ago. The welcome banner was shredded, hanging like a flayed skin from the wooden archway. As Elias and Leo stepped past the threshold, the world behind them simply ceased to exist. The lights of the town square didn't just fade. They were swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt like being submerged in ink. The only light came from the moon, which hung overhead like a dead, lidless eye. The corn was no longer growing in neat, organized rows. The stalks had twisted together, forming high, arched tunnels that felt like the ribcage of a giant beast. Every step they took over the dry earth produced a sound like breaking glass. Leo clutched his bundle of cornstalks, his eyes darting toward every rustle. "Elias, look at the ground," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not dirt anymore." Elias knelt, shining his fading flashlight on the path. The soil had turned into a shimmering, shifting mass of cold, hard objects. It was money, thousands of coins. Pennies, nickels, silver dollars, and crumpled paper bills were packed into the earth, crushed together as if by an immense weight. As Elias watched, a green shoot of corn pushed its way up through a dollar bill, shredding the paper as it grew with visible, unnatural speed. The entity wasn't just taking lives. It was literally feeding on the town's greed, turning their misplaced wealth into its own skeletal structure. A sudden, sharp cry from Leo made Elias jump. A vine, thick as a man's wrist and covered in jagged thorns, had wrapped itself around Leo's ankle. It wasn't just holding him. It was pulling him toward a massive mound of earth in the center of a clearing. "It's got me. Elias, help!" Leo thrashed, but the more he struggled, the tighter the vine became. Elias lunged forward, grabbing a sharp stone from the path, a piece of discarded iron or from the old mines, and hacked at the vine. A thick, black fluid, smelling of sulfur and wet grain, sprayed out as the vine snapped. Leo scrambled back, but the clearing they had entered was far worse than the tunnel. Scattered across the ground were the personal effects of the townspeople. Mayor Miller's gold watch, the librarian's glasses, the heavy silver trophies from the high school gym. Each item was being slowly digested by the roots, turning into a dull, gray ash that blew away in the freezing wind. It's taking everything we thought made us important, Elias realized, his voice a low murmur of horror. The harvester doesn't want our blood. It wants our significance. It's stripping the town of its pride, its money, and its lies until there's nothing left but the bare, starving earth. In the center of the clearing stood the giant effigy of the grinning harvester. It was 40 feet tall, its head reaching toward the dark clouds. But it was no longer made of straw and burlap. It was now a terrifying composite of the town's history. Its skin was made of the old mining ledgers, its eyes were two polished pieces of iron, and its grin was formed from the jagged, broken pieces of the town hall's clock face. It was the physical embodiment of Silver Creek's stolen prosperity. The clicking sound returned, louder now, echoing from the very chest of the giant. The effigy didn't move its limbs, but its shadow stretched out across the clearing, pinning Elias and Leo to the spot. The shadow felt heavy, like a lead blanket. Then, a voice, a sound like a landslide of dry corn, vibrated through the air. It didn't speak in words, but in a series of images that flooded Elias's mind. The cheating of the tribes, the exploitation of the miners, the invention of the fake legend. The entity was showing them the price of their survival. "We have to give it back," Elias gasped, fighting the pressure of the shadow. "Leo, all of it. Not just the silver, but the truth. We have to tell the world that Silver Creek wasn't built on hard work or destiny. It was built on a series of thefts." The giant effigy tilted its massive, paper-covered head. The jagged clock-face grin seemed to widen. It was waiting. The harvester was a judge, and the trial was about to reach its verdict. If they couldn't find a way to offer a truth pure enough to satisfy the ancient hunger, they would become part of the mulch beneath the coins. Greed is a hungry ghost that can never be satiated. The more we take that does not belong to us, the more we lose of ourselves until we are nothing but a collection of the things we possess. The air in the center of the cornfield was so thick with the scent of ozone and decay that Elias felt as though he were breathing underwater. The giant effigy loomed over them, a towering monument to 2 centuries of deception. Its shadow didn't just darken the ground. It seemed to pull the very heat from their bodies. Leo was on his knees, his face pale as ash, his hands clawing at the silver coins that now carpeted the earth. The more he tried to push them away, the more the ground seemed to bubble, threatening to swallow him whole. "Elias, it's not enough to just say it," Leo choked out, his voice a thin reed in the wind. "Look at it. It's too big. A few words won't stop something this old." Elias looked at the giant. He realized that the creature wasn't just a monster. It was a mirror. It was the physical accumulation of every secret kept in Silver Creek, from the grand fraud of the mayor to the small, stinging lies of the neighbors. To defeat it, he couldn't just shout into the wind. He had to perform an act of radical, painful honesty. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ancient diary of Silas Thorne, its leather cover slick with the black fluid of the cornstalks. "You want the truth?" Elias screamed at the giant, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and defiance. "The truth is that we are a town of ghosts. We didn't save ourselves with this festival. We tried to sell a lie because we were too afraid to admit we were failing. We built our homes on land that wasn't ours, and we fueled our lives with coal that poisoned the very air we breathe." As he spoke, Elias began to tear the pages out of the diary, the genuine, painful history of the town's founding. He didn't just drop them. He pressed them against the skin of the giant effigy. Where the paper touched the creature, a brilliant, searing white light erupted. The skin, made of fake flyers and mining ledgers, began to curl and blacken. The giant let out a sound that wasn't a roar, but a long, mournful sigh, the sound of a secret finally being told. "Help me, Leo," Elias yelled, "The silver! Throw the silver back into the earth, but not as a tribute, as a return. Admit that it was never ours to keep." Leo, inspired by Elias's desperation, began to grab handfuls of the silver coins and the locket he had found. But instead of hoarding them, he threw them with all his might toward the dark tree-line, away from the reaper. With every piece of wealth he discarded, his ankle was released from the thorny vines. He stood up, his voice joining Elias's in a chaotic, honest confession of every time they had looked the other way while the town's integrity crumbled. The giant effigy began to shudder. The jagged clock-face grin cracked down the middle, the pieces of metal falling to the ground with heavy thuds. The towering structure of husks and shadow began to lean, its bones of iron or snapping like dry twigs. The entity was starving, because the fuel of deception was being replaced by the cold, hard vacuum of truth. The shadow pinned to Elias and Leo retracted, snapping back toward the base of the monster. Suddenly, a massive burst of wind erupted from the center of the giant. It was a gale of memories, whispers of old miners, the cries of the displaced, and the silent prayers of mothers. The wind tore the rest of the cornfield apart, the stalks disintegrating into dust. Elias and Leo shielded their eyes as the world turned into a swirling vortex of debris and light. The ground beneath them shook with the force of an earthquake as the very foundation of the fake legend was uprooted and cast into the night. When the wind finally died down, the giant was gone. In its place stood nothing but a single small sapling, a genuine, living oak tree, sprouting from the center of the scorched earth. The silver was gone, the coins were gone, and the heavy mist had vanished. Above them, the moon was no longer a bruised purple. It was a clear, silver orb, illuminating a valley that looked honest for the first time in centuries. But the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a town that now had to decide if it could survive without its masks. The truth does not always bring comfort. Often, it brings a scorched earth. But only on scorched earth can something real and lasting finally begin to grow. We must be willing to lose everything we built on a lie to gain the one thing that matters, our souls. The sun rose over Silver Creek not with a roar, but with a tentative golden shimmer that felt like a quiet apology. The fog had retreated into the deepest crevices of the mountains, leaving the town scrubbed clean and unervingly still. Elias and Leo stood at the edge of what used to be the great cornfield. There were no stalks left, no giant effigy, and no coins. Just an expanse of dark, rich soil and a single oak sapling swaying in the breeze. The harvest was over, but the landscape of the town had been irrevocably altered. As they walked back toward the town square, the scale of the supernatural reaping became clear. Silver Creek looked like a sketch of itself that had been partially erased. The flashy neon signs of the new tourist bistros were gone, replaced by the original, weathered brickwork underneath. The mayor's expensive SUV sat in the middle of the road, but its sleek paint had peeled away to reveal a rusted, skeletal frame, a reflection of the town's true financial state. The fake prosperity had been stripped away, leaving only the bare bones of a struggling Appalachian community. The people were beginning to emerge from their homes. They moved slowly, their faces pale and their eyes clear of the glassy fervor that had gripped them during the festival. There were no cheers, no talk of profit, and no mention of the grinning harvester. It was as if a collective fever had broken. They found the librarian sitting on her porch, her gold-rimmed glasses back on her face, clutching a book of genuine local records as if it were a life preserver. The people who had been harvested hadn't died. They had been returned, but they were changed, quieter, humbler, and carrying a weight of memory that words couldn't describe. Elias walked to the town hall steps, where a small crowd had gathered. There was no Mayor Miller to lead them. The mayor had never returned from the shadows, leaving behind only an empty suit and a hard lesson about the price of leadership. Elias looked out at the faces of his neighbors, the bakers, the mechanics, the teachers. He didn't offer a speech about a bright future or a new marketing plan. He simply held up the remains of Silas Thorne's diary. The legend wasn't fake, Elias said, his voice carrying through the silent square. The monster was just the name we gave to our own choices. We tried to build a future on a foundation of ghosts and lies, and the earth wouldn't let us. We are poor today. We are a small, struggling town in the mountains. But for the first time in 200 years, we are telling the truth. And that is the only thing we can actually grow something on. Over the coming months, Silver Creek didn't become a bustling tourist destination. It became something quieter, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking a different kind of American story. People didn't come for scares. They came to see the truth orchard that Elias and Leo began to plant where the cornfield once stood. They planted trees that would take decades to grow, a symbol of a commitment to a future they would never personally see. The opposite of the instant, greedy gratification that had almost destroyed them. The legend of the grinning harvester faded into a cautionary whisper, a story told to children not to scare them, but to teach them that words have power and that the land has a memory. Every October, when the wind sighs through the valley, the people of Silver Creek don't hide. They open their windows and listen. They listen to the rustle of the oak leaves and the steady heartbeat of a town that finally learned that it is better to be a small, honest reality than a grand, glittering lie. The sun set behind the peaks, casting long, peaceful shadows. Elias sat on his porch, his hand now fully healed, with only a faint silver scar, resting on a book of maps. He knew that the shadows would always be there, lurking at the edge of the woods, waiting for the next lie to give them a shape. But as long as the people of Silver Creek remembered the harvest, the harvester would have nothing to feed on. A community's greatest wealth is not found in its treasury, but in its integrity. We are the stewards of our history. If we do not tell the truth about our past, the past will eventually find a way to tell the truth about us.